Redfall is the type of game that should not exist, at least not in the form that we got it. Bad games happen all the time. Broken launches unfortunately happen all the time as well. At this point, a major AAA game releasing unfinished barely even shocks people anymore. It's practically become part of the release calendar. But Redfall was a little bit different. Because Redfall wasn't just some random live service failure, it wasn't just another corporate experiment that collapsed under its own weight. This came from Arkane Austin, the studio behind Prey, a studio tied to a name that used to actually mean something. And what did it used to mean? Atmosphere, freedom, some dense level design, strange worlds, systems that interacted with each other, games that didn't treat the player like an idiot, games that trusted you to observe, experiment, fail, adapt, and importantly, figure things out. And somehow, that studio delivered one of the most lifeless first-party Xbox games ever released. And that is what makes Redfall so fascinating all these years later. Not because it was broken, not because it was boring, not because it failed. Yes, it was all of those things, but because this game kind of feels like a crime scene in a sense. A game where every empty street, every half-finished system, every dead combat encounter, and every confused design choice points back to the same question. How did Arkane Austin even get here? Redfall launched back in May of 2023 as an open-world co-op vampire shooter. On paper, that pitch sounds pretty good. Arkane's impressive design philosophy placed inside a vampire-infested coastal town, a world full of cultists, bloodsuckers, abandoned houses, supernatural threats, and environmental storytelling. This should have been a natural evolution. Instead, however, it became a game that helped bury the studio that made it. And that's why Redfall isn't simply just another bad game. Instead, it's an autopsy of what happens when a studio known for identity, craft, and player freedom gets forced into a shape it was never built to survive in. Redfall wasn't the evolution of Arkane's legacy, though it was something closer to a betrayal. This most certainly was not a game in which deep systems were the focus. It wasn't a game with each room being thoughtfully written to have 5 answers to it. It wasn't just Prey with vampires. It wasn't Dishonored but in a creepy coastal town. It was a jumbled, half-baked product attempting to be 5 games at once and failing miserably at all of them. It was a game that wanted to be a looter shooter, a vampire game you could play in co-op, an individual arcane adventure. It was meant to be a Game Pass pole tent, a big exclusive to the Xbox. Yet, despite pursuing all of those items, it ended up somewhere in between all of them and none of them at the same time. But a bit closer to none of them. And well, that's the real tragedy. The business model was compressing the studio's soul. Not at launch, not with the reviews, definitely not with the memes. Now this is where the story begins. It begins a year ago when a studio known for creating some very specific type of games was forced to pursue a path they never intended it for. Redfall started when large publishers were enamored of live service games, co-op loot systems, and online ecosystems in a pitch meeting where multiplayer arcane game was the exciting prospect on paper, but it was nothing like that. Level design, vampires, co-op, and open world elements provided by Austin, marketable, broad, and potentially huge. The issue, however, is that a good pitch doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good game. The power of Arkane's games is found in their play of space, tension, player choice, and layered systems. You can sneak into a building, discover a secret entrance, combine powers, manipulate your surroundings to defeat your adversaries, and travel an unexpected path that the game never directed you on. And that's the magic. Allow the player tools, drop them in a dense world, and let them solve the problems in their own manner. A co-op shooter with 4 players should be worked up to something totally different. Repeatable combat, enemy density, exciting loot, mission replayability, network stability, systems that maintain a group of players attentively over hours of playtime. Now, all these philosophies can coexist if they're guided from the outset with clarity, and that was something that Redfall unfortunately never had. The crowd wants to be spooky and mysterious, but the co-op is deflating the tension. The hero abilities suggest various types of gameplay, but don't offer much of a boost to the encounters. The weapons desire to feel like loot, but the loot is uninteresting. And the story is supposed to be dark and enigmatic, but the missions were very fluffy, I would say. The town feels handcrafted but primarily empty. Arkane Austin wasn't Bungie, and it wasn't Gearbox. It was never a studio that was solely dedicated to offering an endless online shooter. It was a studio that created single-player, immersive experience, and Redfall pushed that mold into a form that it just didn't fit. But not because studios can't experiment or even change. They definitely can. But because experimentation must have good creative reason. If you've got a really cool multiplayer idea and you're making a multiplayer game, that's fantastic. But if you're making one because executives are interested in a co-op service product, however, well, that's the different. And that's trend chasing, and Redfall completely reeked of it. Hey, post-edit Lethal here. Pretty ironic what I just read out, considering today is when Bungie announced that they're ending their service of Destiny 2 and they're laying off all those people. With, as of now, no Destiny 3 being greenlit, this is pretty ironic. And by the way, we talked about this in depth on our recent live stream that we did over on our gaming podcast channel, which I co-host with a few other guys, so make sure you go check that out if you want to keep up to date with gaming news. It's always a good time on those streams. We'd love to see you there. Anyway, back to the Redfall video. Redfall instead, however, was a generic open world shooter where almost everything just felt like an errand. Almost all the enemies were not programmed, and the world was seldom as awesome as its concept was supposed to be. Now, I don't want to say vampires is the sole reason why this game failed. This was because it just did very little interesting things with them. Vampires should be frightful. They should be the kind of person you want to be intimidated by. They should be unpredictable, fast, dangerous, and make you rethink your approach. They should make you feel like you're being pursued, cornered, outmatched. In Redfall, however, they were kind of just there waiting to be killed. Not scary, not smart, definitely not varied enough. They didn't impose the pressure that the game was supposed to be about. Now, at the launch of the game, the AI was one of the top jokes. Enemies standing around, just acting slow, running into peril, seemingly just oblivious to the situation around them. And that sucks for any game. But that sucks a lot more from Arkane, where everything about the game was about the enemies and the environments and the systems doing cool things altogether. It was here where technical and design errors just became indistinguishable from Redfall. Yes, it was buggy. Yes, there was a lot of rough handling. However, Redfall, no matter how bug-free, still had core gameplay issues, and the gameplay just wasn't good. The battle was a hollow fight. The loot was dragging and drabbing. There was not enough imagination in the missions. There was no density in the world. The enemies were just harmless for the most part. The overall game felt like a compromise to have a structure built around co-op when the solo experience was not as strong, and the co-op wasn't able enough to warrant the compromise. It was in one of the worst places a game can be. Too co-op orientated for classic Arkane fans, and too shallow for looter-shooter fans. Too empty for open world fans, and too repetitive for co-op fans, and too compromised for solo players. Hence the whole better with friends defense just never worked with this game. Because let's be real here, any bad game is better with friends. You can share laughter with the bugs of the game. Boring missions can be hard to mess around with, so we just end up having fun with friends. This is not a recommendation, however, it's a warning sign, but cloaked in a silver lining. But even before launch, Redfall was always online, and that just puts us on guard for solo play. When you are playing by yourself, why should you have to have an internet connection? The player doesn't really gain much from it, and this sort of move benefits the structure of live service rather than the person playing it. It made ownership feel bad. It exacerbated the issue of preservation. It also took a stance that this game was built around an ecosystem first, and then player base second. Then, the controversy surrounding the 30 frames per second cap. Now, Redfall was a game that was only available on the Xbox Series X or Xbox Game Store on the PC, and Xbox is a large name in the gaming industry. And at the time, Redfall was also helped to push the stories that Game Pass is important and everyone should have it. And this is why first-party roster is changing. Rather, instead it released with a quality mode only, and 30 FPS in the beginning and then 60 later. This was a bit embarrassing for an online co-op shooter in 2023 on current gen platforms. And then as the reviews began to drop in, it just went even further downhill from there. It wasn't received as a bungled but promising title, it was taken with a calamity. One of the main things noted was the lack of critical thinking and gameplay. Missions just weren't particularly interesting, and there were issues with the game and world, and there was no distinctive editing and no content to make the game worth playing. It was a punching bag almost immediately, and the criticism was easy to understand, given the issues that were readily apparent as soon as you logged in. The movement wasn't on, the shooting was average, the whole world seemed empty of people, and to be fair, there maybe was a few moments that felt like this game had some type of atmosphere, but they never lasted. The presentation of the whole game failed to sell the ideas of the story. The co-op was a little bit fun, I guess, but not fun enough to make it worthwhile. Now, one of the big players here is Xbox. Redfall didn't come into the world just out of nowhere. It came into the world as a Bethesda game, as a Game Pass game, as one of the first significant exclusives following the ZeniMax acquisition. Now, if you're making billions and acquire the publisher, you don't get to claim victories and hide from your failures. For the brand value of Bethesda, you are responsible for Bethesda. And maybe this guy over here. Now, it is fair to say that Redfall began development prior to the acquisition, and so not all the problems here were created by Microsoft. However, with ZeniMax's ownership, this became their game, their first party release, their reflection, which begs the thought of how nobody stepped in to stop this. How does a big first party game get to this point without anyone doing something? How did a studio such as Arkane Austin get so far off target and no one of power even questions just what they're doing? How can anything come out of this and still be branded with Xbox brand? Now, this was 2023, so they were just slapping that name on any piece of shit they could make. The typical damage control cycle ensued after the launch. Updates arrived, the shields gave positive reviews. Eventually came the 60 frames per second mode. Stealth takedowns were added. Enemies were buffed and accessibility was improved. Later, offline mode and solo pausing were added. We're in the big leagues now, Redfall. Yes, these are good changes, but they should have been there from the very start, but I guess they're welcome updates. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at this, by the time they got there, it was far too late. First impressions have a tendency to be last impressions. There are games that can make a comeback, but it takes a solid base and commitment to the long haul and a player base that still thinks the game can be what it wants to be. That was not the case for Redfall at all. It started too slowly, never gained the trust, and never had an audience to recover from its mistakes. But the story took an even darker turn from there. Microsoft closed Arkane Austin in 2024, part of larger cuts throughout Bethesda and Xbox. That's when it was no longer a bad game, and something much uglier. No longer was it just Arkane released a shit game, now it was Arkane Austin was in more than a few development woes, released a game that did them absolutely no favors, and then got their ass kicked. Redfall was not the sole reason for Arkane Austin's demise. Microsoft closures were as much a result of corporate decisions as were the other closures. Despite releasing a very popular game, Hi-Fi Rush, Tango Games Works was also shut down. So no, it's not as simple as a bad game equals a dead studio. In reality, it was more business and far more depressing than that. However, things were not to be for Redfall as they ended up as a tombstone. Arkane Austin does deserve to be remembered for making Prey, one of the more interesting immersive sims of its era. The very type of game they've always wished for. Creative, clever, weird systems, confident systems. However, for most people, I think they're going to look back and just remember them for Redfall. That's because games like Prey are difficult to sell and hard to market, and don't necessarily blow up commercially. So publishers start asking the wrong questions when they look at them. What if there was a co-op? What if it had loot? What if it could be a live service? What if it had vampires? What if we just copied other industry trends at the moment that are dying? And these are the types of questions that get asked that will lead to the death of a once good studio. Now, all of this is part of Redfall's story beyond Redfall. Publishers extol their love for creativity, but they follow the trend. They claim they desire individual studios, but then push those studios into market-tested formulas. They claim they're looking for long-term franchises and they make decisions that destroy the trust from day one. But what's worst of all is there are glimpses of something better in the ruins of Arkane Austin. There was a real potential for the setting. There was a bit of Arkane in some of the environmental storytelling. Now, the reason why people might ask, what went wrong with Redfall, It's not just one thing, it's several things. It's not only the atrocious AI or the 30 frames per second, not only the bugs or Game Pass, not only the Xbox or ZeniMax, not only Arkane, all of it was wrong. Bad direction, wrong identity, wrong studio, wrong system, wrong talent, wrong publisher, wrong platform holder, wrong launch. And then the closing of the studio is when it all went from embarrassing to tragic. Redfall is a warning. Creative studios do not come packaged in the same way as content factories. Not all good developers are to be encouraged to go into a style they are seeing at the moment. Live service design cannot magically make a game bigger or more successful, but when executives pursue the market instead of really knowing what the studio is, they can ruin the very thing that they've purchased. Xbox was well deserving of all the backlash that happened from this. This wasn't as simple as an unavoidable accident. It was a long time coming and a long time gone. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a thumbs up on it. Subscribe if you're new, all that good stuff. Now, if you did enjoy this one, we've actually got another one right here about the history of live service games that I think you may enjoy. So, thank you very much, and we'll see you all in the next video.